No audio. Yeah, I just noticed, guys. Hello, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, episode 2 of Confessions of a Monopolist, chapter 4, The Fight for the City. As for my interest in politics increased, so did the necessity for it. As I had entered politics to protect my real estate from excessive taxation, so I had been slowly enveloped by it through my street railway and gas interests. We were constantly opening streets, expanding our tracks or gas mains. It was necessary to secure many privileges from the council and the administration. In time, our superintendent, who was familiar with all the boys, came to place their friends and relatives in positions of employment. We were able to do this to the thousands of employees upon our payrolls. In this way, we were able to keep on friendly terms with the aldermen. While the director of streets was usually appointed at my suggestion, in course of time, the expiration of our franchises began to concern us. They had been originally granted for 25 years at a time when they were of questionable value. As time went on, however, and the city grew, the public came to appreciate the value of our grant, which was evident in the quotations of our stock. Moreover, the capitalization had been more than trebled by us in order to keep down the dividends to a reasonable limit. The renewal of these franchises had become a political issue. One of the newspapers, which we had not been able to control, insisted upon absurd concessions from the company. They pointed to the fact that our stock had been watered and that the plant could be duplicated at the present time at about 1/4 of the selling price of the securities. They aroused class feeling and were threatening our property rights. Another company had secured possession of several streets which we had neglected to occupy because they did not seem necessary to us. This company was controlled by another crowd in the city who were backed by a couple of banks. They offered to accept the franchises enjoyed by us on terms more advantageous to the city. They said they would give universal transfers and a percentage of their gross receipts if our franchises were renewed to them. They also offered to purchase our plant at its appraised value. The universal transfers appealed to the working classes, who saw in this a material reduction in their car fare, while payment of a portion of the gross receipts to the city treasury appealed to the property owners, who saw it as a means of reducing their taxes. A municipal election was approaching, and the mayor and council, who were to be elected, would have the franchise to dispose of. There was considerable talk of nominating for mayor upon the Republican ticket a successful businessman by the name of Sterling, who had no political experience. I was not personally acquainted with Sterling and could get but little definite information about him. I sent one of our stockholders to find out how he stood on the franchise question, but his replies were not to our satisfaction. He said that he could not see why the city should not treat the question just as an individual would, why the franchise should not be given to the company offering the largest return. It was a simple business proposition, and while he had not given the matter much thought, it seemed to him the company could well afford to pay liberally for the privilege. I asked Sterling to come and see me, for as chairman of the Republican committee, I was interested in the makeup of the party ticket. I tried to make him see our point of view. We had come into the city, I said, when the street railway business had little money in it. We had made our investment on a speculative proposition. Through the growth of the railway system, the city had been developed. Its boundaries had been extended, and the railway had been a great agency in its upbuilding. It was true, I admitted, that our stock was worth more than the physical value of the property, but then so was the stock of any corporation that had any goodwill attached to it. Moreover, many of our stockholders were widows and orphans, and it would be unjust to deprive them of their property, which would be done if the terms of our franchise were materially modified or we were dispossessed of the rights of way we had enjoyed for so long. I tried to make him see our point of view and the reasonableness of our wishes. He finally said that if the things I said were true, we ought to be able to carry passengers cheaper than anybody else, because we knew the situation, we had possession. Anyway, he thought the franchise ought to be disposed of to the company that offered the best terms. I was unable to make anything out of him. He was not open to reason. So I sent for a lot of party leaders and told them flatly that if Sterling were nominated, they could expect no campaign funds from us or from any of the banks or companies in which I was interested. That we could not stand for such a candidate. He was threatening the property rights that we had built up and was a dangerous man. I knew I had sown the seed in the right place. Pretty soon interviews began to appear in the papers about his candidacy. Someone dug up a story about a strike that he had once in his factory. It was not much of a strike, and had been very shortly settled, but it was hinted that this would alienate the labor vote. Moreover, it was suggested that he was a reformer. This idea was exaggerated until in a few days' time he appeared to be a fanatic. The boys said he was too good, that he would enforce the Sunday closing laws on the saloon, and at the brewing interests and liquor league became alarmed. They protested against the nomination of Sterling and insisted that people wanted a liberal Sunday. By this means, in a few days' time, almost all the active political workers were arrayed against Sterling. He had not sufficient experience in politics to get at the newspaper man himself, and was easily disheartened at the opposition which his candidacy seemed to arouse in the charge which had come over the public sentiment. For prior to that time, his nomination had been looked upon as a foregone conclusion. I had some of our friends call upon him and suggest that he ought not to go into politics anyhow. They said it would hurt his business, that it would not only make a lot of enemies for him, but it would be necessary for him to neglect his other interests. We got some of the labor leaders to make an investigation of his strike. The Liquor Dealers Association came out in interviews against him. Much of this was inspired by us and reached the rank and file of the party through ward channel leaders. A few days before the convention, Sterling announced that he would not be a candidate under any circumstances, and his name was not even presented. As a man, he was a most estimable fellow, and he had been reasonable upon street railway matters. And had he been reasonable upon street railway matters, I should have been pleased to have him mayor. All this time, we have been preparing to spring our own candidate when the time was ripe. We had picked out a young fellow who had been a very satisfactory alderman and who was well known to me. I had secured a position for one of his brothers in a bank, while I had helped him in very substantial ways in his business. Jackson was a man of commonplace abilities with a general reputation of being a good fellow. He was properly anxious to succeed, made very few enemies, and was open-minded and liberal in his views. The mayor enjoyed very large powers. Not only did he exercise the vote, but he appointed the departmental heads and through them distributed the patronage of the party. In this way, he controlled or was in position to control the machine, which it was necessary for us to have in hand. The principal fight, however, was likely to be for the council. Our superintendent had this in hand. He picked out men here and there as candidates, supplied them with funds to carry on their campaign, and organized local political clubs to aid them. Most of these candidates were comparatively unknown. Many of them were under substantial obligations to us in many ways. It was always possible for me to help them through the party organization, for as I was chairman, and particularly the treasurer as well, there was no difficulty in this respect. In this way, we were able to control most of the ward caucuses, and the majority of the men nominated for the council were our choice. The vote for delegates to the nominating convention was light. On the evening before the convention, we had a conference in my office and fixed up the slate. Enough men were taken into our confidence to make sure of the arrangement going through easily, and in the morning the idea was quietly circulated from group to group until it became the sense of the convention. Whatever opposition existed was unorganized and badly led. Moreover, we controlled the temporary chairman who called the convention to order and appointed the committee on credentials. Through these means, we were in a position to seat friendly delegations had contests been necessary. Everything was so well greased, however, that no serious contests arose. Our man was made permanent chairman, and the slate, as made up, went through without dissent. Jackson was nominated without opposition, and the executive committee, which had control of the Republican organization, was organized to our satisfaction. All was now easy sailing. The city was safely Republican by 7,000 votes, and I had the party thoroughly in control, for the executive committee was not only of my selection, but as I controlled the campaign funds and the organization made up of the existing city employees, opposition would have been foolish as well as ineffectual. However, I had always found it wise to keep in touch with the Democratic organization as well. While they had not elected a mayor for many years, there were many wards from which they returned aldermen, and it was necessary to keep on good terms with them. In line with this program, I had picked out Terrence McGann as the head of the Democratic organization. He was a man for whom I had a great liking, and he was very fond of me. I had started him in politics. He was a lusty Irishman of about 30 years of age and had been interested in politics all his life. When I first met him, he was working in bottling works, and I had recognized him as a natural politician. He was one of the radiant kind. He was as frank and cordial to me as to any one of the boys. I liked him, and he liked being liked. There was a certain big natural dignity about him, too, that made him a born leader. It always did me good to see him enter my office. He cheered things up so much. I had started him in business, having loaned him sufficient money to open a saloon. Soon his influence extended from his ward into the surrounding district. His very instinct for doing a kindly thing made him liked, and added to this, he had been able to place many men in our employment from all over the city. This fact added to his power with the boys. In addition to this, he always had a bunch of money at election time, and as the Democratic Party was a minority one and had few offices at its disposal, this gave him strong claims to the leadership. I had induced him to try to secure control of the organization, and there being little opposition, he was easily successful. Terence had never made any money out of politics himself. He was comparatively poor and was in politics because he liked it. I used to send my own family physician around to attend his family when they were ill, and on one occasion had supplied him and his wife with railroad passes to Atlantic City. And all the boys liked them. He took care of them, and he was unremitting in his efforts to secure them positions. His idea of an honest politician was one who would stay bought. So far as his relations with me were concerned, it was always on the assumption that I was in politics for the same reason that he was, because I liked it or enjoyed power or some other reason that he could not make out. At any rate, he always assumed an air of ignorance of what I wanted. By this time, I thoroughly appreciated the necessary intimacy between my business and politics. They were identical. They depended upon each other. And in devoting myself to politics, I was in reality devoting myself to business. I sent for Terence. The following day, he came in to see me, and I asked him who they were going to run for mayor this fall. The Democratic convention is coming on in a few weeks, I said, and I presume you will be able to control the situation as usual. That's the thing I've been wanting to see you about for some days, he said. You know, we have been talking about Williams, who ran before. Well, we can nominate him all right, and he will be defeated just as he was before unless Jim Ballantyne makes us some trouble. I had seen Ballantyne's name in the newspapers, but did not know anything about him. I asked Terence who he was. Well, he's a young fellow who came to the city some years ago and has been making himself busy in politics lately. He recently made a corking speech at the Jackson Day banquet and got the boys all stirred up. He is the fellow who defended the Mulders Union in the United States court in an injunction suit brought to prevent their picketing during the strike. The laboring men are all for him and say he can beat your man in a walk. He is very popular with the boys and will control the committee and can organize a convention all right. If he goes out for the nomination and makes canvass, I fear he will beat us hands down, for Williams isn't strong, and I don't see what I can do if he is nominated except get into the bandwagon. I went to see Ballantyne myself the other day to see how he feels about running. He said he had not yet made up his mind, that he did not think he could afford to run, but that he was going into the convention to show up the fact that the Democratic Party was just a part of the Republican machine, that it did not stand for anything and had been bought and sold long enough. He opened up pretty hot on you, too. He said it was a nice situation where a man could not run for office on either the Republican or Democratic tickets without asking the street railway company's permission. He also said that if he ever were mayor, you would have to pay the city every dollar the new franchises were worth and your taxes as well. Just as I was going out, he said, you might tell Palmer for me, Terence, that I have the affidavit of Frank Buckley, who was sent to the penitentiary last week for accepting a bribe while on the jury in that street railway personal injury case, and I know where the money came from that bribed him, and that in the future Palmer had better not let his notes to his superintendent get mixed up with the currency. He says he has a letter that he got from Buckley written by you, putting up the job to bribe the jury. And you might tell him, he added, that Buckley is a lot more honest than the man who gave him the money, and that moreover he was square, for he preferred to go down the road for 3 years rather than give up this evidence that would have soaked Palmer and his superintendent as well. Here was a pretty situation. I remember writing such a note and slipping it in a bunch of bills that I had sent to Staunton, our superintendent. If Ballantyne had this note, he might present it to the grand jury. If he ran for mayor, he might use it publicly. This was the worst box I had ever gotten into. I was at first inclined to take a trip to Europe until the whole thing blew over, and would have done so had not the franchise question been so important. I let Terence go and asked him to find out anything more about Ballantyne that he could. And the feeling among the boys, and come back and tell me in the morning. I then sent for our attorney and laid the situation before him. He was a resourceful lawyer and had drawn many franchises for us that were as full of barbs as a rose bush of thorns. They contained simple provisions that passed security, the scrutiny of the public, but when once held the community like an anchor. He saw the situation at a glance. We must get Ballantyne out of the way for the present, he said. Do you think him honest? Apparently so, I replied, and that is Terence's opinion. I think I can arrange that, he said. What would you think of making him special attorney for the company? give him some of the trial work to do. I can tell him that there is more of that work than we can properly attend to, that we have been watching his court work for some time and want to employ him by special retainer to look after a portion of it for us. That was a brilliant inspiration. Offer him $5,000 a year, I suggested. Even $7,500 if necessary. Get a contract with him for 3 years if you can. Long enough to cover the statute of limitations, he suggested with a smile. But Ballantyne was not to be had so easily. He took the matter under consideration. He said he had a couple of cases against the road that would have to try before he could decide. The next few weeks were the most uncomfortable I'd ever passed. I was more than ever tempted to cut and run away. I would wake up in the night thinking of the power Ballantyne had over me, but I concluded to wait for the Democratic convention. With Terrence, we had prepared a slate that the Republican ticket could easily defeat. Williams was to be nominated for mayor, and the councilmanic nominees had all been provided for. Ballantyne did not seem to be making any canvass, and I had about concluded that he was not going to run. The Democratic convention met at 9 in the morning. About noon, I received a telephone message from Terrence saying that he wanted to see me right away, but that he did not want to come to my office. Meet me in room 360 in the Arlington Hotel, I said. I'll be right over. When I reached the hotel, Terrence was already in the room. I could see that things had gone wrong. What happened, Terrence? I asked. Oh, they've cleaned up the organization, broken the slate, and carried everything they own away, he said. By some means or other, they got control of O'Brien, the temporary chairman. And he declared their man elected permanent chairman. That devil of a labor leader, Cowan, put Ballantyne in nomination. He got 3/4 of the vote, and then the convention made it unanimous. They stole the organization from us and paid the temporary chairman for his desertion by nominating him for president of the council. I never saw such a wild lot of Democrats in my life, but they put up a fine ticket, and unless I am much mistaken, are going to give you and your man Jackson a run for your life. I saw that Terrence was inclined to go with his party, and he seemed to think that I was responsible for his defeat and the discredit into which he had come with the organization. I felt that I would have to act in a very careful way, or he would go over to Ballantyne with the organization. That was a thing which must be stopped at all hazards, for I had to make use of the Democratic Party and to use Terrence to do it. So I said quickly, of course, you could not help it, Terrence. The trouble was the Citizens Railway that is trying to get possession of our franchises put up too much money. They bought the convention and nominated Ballantyne. They must have lined up the delegates in some way and are trying to beat us out of the way. Then I showed him how his control of the party would be destroyed if Ballantyne was elected. For, of course, he would build up a machine of his own, I said, and the present organization will not be recognized. He has made war on you, Terrence, when he should have come to you as the head of the party. Finally, I said, now, Terrence, you know we have never been defeated. We have a safe majority here of 2,000 to 3,000, and if Jackson is elected, as he will be, I will arrange so that you and your friends are taken care of. He is under obligations to me. I will tell him that as the contest is close, he cannot afford to ignore any help that you can give him. I think I can arrange so that you will be permitted to control the nominations of the police. Of course, if you throw your support to Jackson, this will not be so difficult, I said, because the department is under civil service rules, and if he appoints Democrats instead of Republicans, the public will say that he is conducting the department on a nonpartisan basis. Terrence seemed to be fully convinced that he had been badly treated, that he had been defeated too thoroughly through the use of money, and that if Ballantyne were elected, his influence would be at an end. To clinch matters and put him under further obligations, I said, I have just received word this morning from the superintendent of our mines at Spring Valley that he wants a new superintendent. I concluded to offer the place to your brother if you think he would accept it, if he would care to accept it. The campaign began in good earnest. Both of the leading papers were owned by influential men. Within the next few days, I had half a dozen leading advertisers go to the editor of the Herald, the Democratic organ, and suggest that while they did not want to appear to be interfering with the policy of the paper, the Democratic Party had nominated a man for mayor whom it would be dangerous to see elected. They said he was working with the labor unions and was nominated by them, and that should a strike break out in the city, there was no knowing what he would do. There was danger that he would not protect property and would refuse to call out the militia in case of disturbance. The city already had a bad name among businessmen the country over, they suggested, and if it were known that a labor leader was mayor, it would probably hurt its business interests. This had its visible effect, for while the Herald did not openly endorse the Republican candidate, it did not support Ballantyne, and gave its columns to the fullest discussion of our meetings and printed any news we sent them. Ballantine plunged right into the campaign. He made the street railway issue prominent. He ignored the residence districts almost entirely, holding his meetings in the mill and factory districts. He turned out to be a good campaigner and worked up public sentiment, as I have never known it to be aroused on a local election. I went to hear him at the opening meeting. He said the question before the people was a simple one. It was, shall the corporations control the city or the city control the corporations? He coined a whole lot of phrases like it is better for the city to help than to hurt, meaning that the poorer classes should be given a chance to work in some honest way rather than in the workhouse, or an ounce of recreation is worth a pound of punishment. The saloon is the poor man's club. Make the parks the poor man's club. It is better to make people happy than to make them fearful. I could see by the faces of the men that he was awakening their interest. So far as I could learn, he had no money to spend. His workers were always the voluntary ones. Unconsciously, I became interested in what he was saying and crowded to the front. He evidently recognized me, for after he had continued in this way for some time, he concluded by saying, as you know, I am not a politician. I have never had as much experience in politics as many of you who are here. But during the past few years, I have seen enough of this city to know that it has not mattered much which of the two parties was in power. For in either event, the gentleman who stands before me, Mr. Palmer, was the real ruler of the city. For years, you and I have gone to the polls to cast our votes for one candidate or another, but whoever was elected, we were merely voting the one ticket, and that ticket was made up by William Palmer, the president of the Electric Railway Company. Today, he is chairman of the Republican Executive Committee. He made out a slate for the Republican Convention, and you and I and all the people of this great city read in the papers the morning before the convention just who was to be nominated, and we read it without a suggestion of surprise. We have become so accustomed to having such things done for us that we have ceased to care, and the shame is that the same thing has been true of our own party. Who has ever been the leader of the Democratic Party, he asked. Terence McGann, someone said. Yes, Terence McGann, he replied. I have no desire to say anything mean of Terence, for so far as I know, he never did a mean or dishonest thing in his life. And while he and I are on different sides in this contest, I will leave it to the gentleman who has recently entered this room, Mr. William Palmer, if Terence McGann did not confer with him just prior to the Democratic Convention in order to make up a slate, and if he and Terence did not have a meeting in the Arlington Hotel immediately after the convention to map out plans to beat the Democratic ticket. I make that charge, Mr. Palmer, and ask you to come forward on the platform and deny it if you care to, for I have no desire to do any man injustice, and I have every reason to believe that you will tell the truth. I did not move. I was taken by surprise. The crowd all turned and looked at me. I stared to the speaker's stand. I scarcely knew why. I looked into the faces of the first crowd I had ever addressed. As calmly as I could, I said, I come out as a citizen to hear both sides of this case. It is true I am the president of Electric Railway, but am I for that reason an enemy of the people? Think what you would do if you had to walk miles to your work. Think about the street railway company has done for the upbuilding of the city. Do we not pay taxes the same as do other people? Do we not give good accommodation? Is it not a legitimate industry? Times are good, I said. The country is prosperous. Men have work and wages are high. Then turning to Ballantine, I said, I do not feel called upon to answer your questions. You are a lawyer out here stirring up class feeling in a country which, thank God, is free from classes. You are arousing a spirit of discontent, of socialism, of anarchy, and it will be a sad day for the good name of this city and for its industries if a socialist leader like you is elected mayor. This seemed to have a visible effect upon the audience, for I have noticed that even the laboring man is fair-minded and looks out for his own interests. But I did not like the enthusiasm of that crowd. I saw many of my own party workers there and heard that they were more or less indifferent in the campaign. The next day, I called a large number of businessmen into my office. I told them my experience the night before. This is getting serious, I said. If that man is elected mayor, property will not be safe. Manufacturing plants will no longer come here. He will raise the taxes and drive business from the city. We started in to raise a large campaign fund. I suggested that we organize a city reform club. I called in one of the leading clergymen and had a talk with him. I said, Dr. Jameson, this present contest is one the clergy cannot afford to neglect. This campaign threatens the home. Democratic Party is in league with the liquor interests. They will throw open the saloons on Sunday if Ballantine is elected, and I happen to know they have raised a large fund for his election. And you know what will happen if they get into control. We will have an open Sunday. The city will be an open town. The gambling houses will run again, and our children will not be safe from this evil, while we'll be subjected to all the criminal things that follow a European Sunday. Don't you think it would be a good thing for the churches to do a little campaign work? Isn't it a good proverb to follow? When bad men conspire, good men should organize. Now, if you can arrange for a citizens' organization to hold a big public meeting a few nights before the close of the campaign, and also have all the ministers preach a sermon on the necessity of taking an interest in local matters about the same time, I think you would be doing a great service to the city that already owes you so much. And in case the meeting is arranged for you, I think I can secure any money you may need from some of the members of your congregation. Prior to this time, I had sent a man to Ballantyne's old home to learn what I could about his early life and what sort of a citizen he had been prior to coming to the city. But all reports showed him to be an industrious young fellow who had worked his way through college and had studied law while teaching school. I also got some of our stockholders to call on the members of the City Reform Club. I knew many of its contributing members, and some of them were connected with me in the same banks. These I induced to appear before its executive committee and urged the necessity of ridding the city of the dangerous demagogic influences that had arisen in the Democratic Party. They also spoke of the necessity of protecting the city from an open Sabbath and the control of the saloons. Soon, all of these influences were thoroughly aroused. They organized local ward committees in the churches, while the Reform Association began to issue bulletins on the mayoralty situation. This they had never done before, as they were organized simply for councilmanic matters. But they just justified themselves by saying that the issue before the people was so monumentous that they had decided to enter the field and protest against the election of a man who was manifestly designing to create a machine, a man who was in league with the liquor element, and who had said in his public speeches that the saloon was the poor man's club, and that until the people furnished him something better, the working man was not to be condemned for going there. The Sunday before election, all the churches preached a crusade against Ballantyne. They did not mention him in so many words, nor attack the Democratic Party, but they urged the people to be aroused to the election, to defend their families and their homes from the saloon, from the demagogic utterances that were arousing class feeling in America. There did not seem to be a chance for our defeat. The sentiment against Ballantyne was so strong that the betting was 2-1 in favor of Jackson, the Republican candidate who had been almost overlooked in the campaign. This was fortunate for us, for he was not a good speaker and had done little in the council, although he was a good fellow and an active church worker. But the council was as important to us as the mayoralty. To this we devoted much of our attention. The mayoralty contest was so absorbing that the public paid little particular attention to the council. McGann had picked men for us in the short Democratic wards, and had supplied them with such funds as they needed, while I had chosen the men in the Republican wards, which we could control. This was a comparatively easy matter, as McGann was familiar with his men through the Democratic organization, while I knew all the men of the Republican ticket. They came to me for funds, and in this way I made myself acquainted with their necessities, habits, positions, and friends. I made my assistance that was given them a personal matter and talked about the party and the necessity of keeping things in line owing to the presidential election that was coming on the following year. On election day, the odds were 3-1 against Ballantyne. The better element, by that I mean the men of wealth who usually remain away from the polls, was aroused by the work which had been done by the reform organization of the churches. They came out early and voted straight. All indications were that a large vote would be pulled, and that the entire Republican ticket would go through. In the evening of election day, we all met at the Metropolitan Club. The Republican candidate was there, and a special wire had been run into the rooms. The early wards to come in were the Democratic ones about the mills. They showed Ballantyne gains, but that was to be expected. The East End wards were slow in coming, and they would easily overcome that by reason of the larger vote which had been polled. And this we were not disappointed. And after a good sprinkling of Republican wards had showed up, all indicating a good vote, we began to feel more easy and be pretty confident of the result. But the outlying mill wards continued black. The feeling of Ballantyne seemed to be very strong there. Soon one of the German wards came in, a conservative, well-to-do, usually Republican. Even it showed heavy Democratic gains. These same losses came from one after another of the foreign wards. Thompson, one of our directors, said, "That shows the socialism that is being brought to America by those who came here for our freedom and then don't seem to be satisfied with it when they get it. Our naturalization laws ought to be changed," he said. "What do these men know of American institutions? They come here and after a few years' time have as much influence at the ballot as any one of us who has lived here since the founding of the city. They ought to limit the suffrage to those who pay taxes." By 10 o'clock, Ballantyne was in the lead, but there were still some heavy Republican wards to hear from. They came in slowly, but Democratic gains continued. By midnight, the extras were out announcing Ballantyne's election by several thousand majority. We could hardly believe the result. No one had expected it save Ballantine, but he had confidently claimed his election from the first. We had been beaten at the polls. For the first time in our experience, we had failed to control the situation. The people had been carried away by an appeal to class feeling. Nothing remained to do but to carry the fight into the council. And for this we were well prepared. We could easily control a majority of the aldermen, and if Ballantine could not be brought over to us, we felt pretty confident of our ability to secure enough votes to override his veto. Okay, let's see. Wow, chapter 5 is long. I think we can do it, though. Oh, chapter 5. We dethroned the mayor and obtained a franchise. The day after the election was called, a hurried meeting of the directors. The Republican committee made charges of repeating and colonization on the part of the Democrats, but never proved it. We examined the council as elected. It numbered 27 members. Had the mayor been with us, the franchise would have been a simple matter. We would then have had to secure but 14 votes to have a majority. But with him against us, we had to get 2/3 of the council to pass the ordinance over his veto. To be safe, we needed 18 men. We scrutinized the list of aldermen. There were Murphy O'Brien, Callaghan, O'Donnell, and Smith from the lower Democratic wards. These men had been selected by McGann and could probably be relied upon. Murphy O'Brien and O'Donnell were holdovers from the old council, and Terence had always been able to keep them in line by providing places for their friends and relatives on our lines. I sent for Terence and told him to see these fellows as well as any other aldermen whom he knew, and give jobs to as many of his friends as were needed. On the Republican side, there were Thompson, McKay, Green, Jenkins, and Lloyd that I thought we could bank on. I knew them all and had picked them to run because they were loyal party men. During the campaign, I had supplied them with funds and had made their success a personal matter with me. In this way, we made ourselves solid at very little cost. We then arranged for a caucus of the Republican members of the council. Members, I think. They were in the majority, and we could organize the council and elect the president and clerk. They sent for me to talk over the situation. I made a short speech and suggested that it was up to them to defend the city that a demagogue had been elected mayor, a socialist, who advocated municipal ownership. Moreover, I said, it is incumbent upon you to prevent the building up of a democratic machine. This man Ballantine has dragged the street railway question into politics, which it ought not to be, for it is a business proposition and should be solved on a business basis. With this, they seemed to agree. We decided on the council nominees and chose Thompson for president. His brother was a painter and had a contract with us for the painting of our cars. We knew he was all right, for he had been in the council for 2 terms, and I had some evidence against him. If necessary, I would not permit him to forget. Through Thompson, we made up the committees on railways and lighting and streets. We were particularly interested in these. The other committees were parceled out among the fellows who had to be reconciled. This put us in a strategic position in all legislation affording our interests, for it was difficult to pass any legislation that a committee saw fit to hold up. The ordinance went to the committees before consideration by the council, and a 2/3 vote was required by the rules to force a report from the committees. We now felt secure so far as any adverse legislation was concerned. But further than the 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans we could not get, 9 more were needed to make us secure. There were 15 Republican members in the council, and it was possible that if we made our ordinance a party measure, we could line them all through the caucuses. But we appreciated that this was a bad thing for the party. It would give Ballantine the opportunity that he wanted. He would make it a party issue, and that might endanger everything at the next election. The situation was very disturbing. Up to that time, I had never paid any money for votes or legislation. We had been able to secure what we wanted through the control of the parties, through friendship, through contracts, or the simple desire on the part of many aldermen to be good fellows and to do what McGann or Buckley wanted. But our directors were not also squeamish. Somehow or other, the franchises must be got. They were about to expire, and if they were not renewed, the stock would not be worth 10 cents on the dollar. Much of it was up at the banks as collateral, and that gave the bankers an interest as well as our stockholders. Moreover, we had a plan on foot to combine the gas and street railway franchises and sell them to an Eastern syndicate. But this could only be done if the franchises were satisfactory. The feeling on the part of the directors was that the business could not be run without the use of money. They said they were being held up and bled by a lot of fellows who did not know the difference between $1,000 and $1 million, and that the entire agitation was a hold-up game anyhow. My objections were overruled by the board, and $50,000 was voted as legal expenses. Personally, I wish I was in a bad position also. A lot of my friends had put money into the stock. I told them it was a good buy at the ruling price. Then there was a lot of widows and orphans whose funds were invested in this way, and I felt that this trust had to be protected by some means. We studied the makeup of the council on the Democratic side. A number were friends of Ballantine. They were working men who had gone in on his platform. The Republicans were of a somewhat better sort, being clerks, insurance men, small storekeepers, and a couple of lawyers. One of them was a blacksmith, and Buckley, our superintendent, gave him some work to do. He followed that up with larger businesses and made it a point not to complain about the prices charged. Another was in the insurance business. He was giving our employees liability and fire insurance. Another was a personal friend of Buckley, and he endorsed his note for $200 to take care of a mortgage on his house. Prior to this time, Buckley and McGann had been getting acquainted with all the councilmen. They learned their habits, their friends, and financial conditions. Buckley thought he had 15 men fixed, although he did not tell me how, on the organization of the council. The slate went through without opposition. The president and clerk endorsed by the caucus were elected. The committees were announced as we had arranged. But just before adjournment, to our surprise and consternation, Lawrence, a young Republican lawyer just elected to the council, moved that a special committee of 5, named in the resolution, be created to consider the street railway problem, and that all railway legislation should be referred to it. He made a speech in its favor, saying that it was the one matter that was commanding most attention. We were not prepared for this angle. The president left the chair to oppose it, but the other Republicans looked upon it as a sort of caucus measure that they were not onto and carried it through by a majority vote of 1. Lawrence had been nominated in one of the resident districts without opposition and had been overwhelmingly elected. He was but recently from college and had been practicing a few years. He was a likable fellow but impetuous and had no experience in politics. In the campaign, he had paid but little attention to the regular committee, but had made a house-to-house canvass for the nomination. We had not given much concern about him, as he was well connected and his father was a large merchant. We had fancied that he could be counted on in the council. I saw that he would have to be handled gingerly. I sent one of the city contractors to him with some business. He told Lawrence that he wanted him to represent him in some litigation, and it had come to him because he was not too busy and could give attention to his needs. He brought the conversation around to the council and asked him why he had introduced the resolution for a special committee. That was a slap at the regular committee, you know, and has aroused all the boys against you, of course, he said. That's all right, but do not destroy any possibility of good work in the council by ignoring the other fellows. It's best to work with the organization, he said, and not get into a row at the start-off. Lawrence seemed surprised at this and said, why, I had no intention of slamming anybody. The resolution was perfectly natural. I wanted to learn something about the street railway question, and when Thompson appointed the regular committee, I concluded that he had done so without giving the matter much thought, and that a special committee like this would be hailed with joy by the members of the regular committee, as it would let them off from a lot of work. As a matter of fact, I have not given the matter any thought until I got into the council chamber. He said he would see Thompson and explain to him that he had not intended to hurt anybody's feelings. I felt relieved when I heard this. Lawrence had just stumbled into the thing, but I concluded that we had better reach him in some way, for I knew that he was honest. So I sent a number of prominent men over to him to see him and talk the situation over. I thought if I could arouse his party loyalty, that I would get him in this way. I had these men talking about the danger from Ballantyne's building up a machine from the saloons and the gambling houses. They brought in the franchise question incidentally, as if they were citizens interested in his conduct and gratified that a man of his type should have been willing to enter the council. They said it was a splendid thing that the young men were going into politics in this way. They would be the salvation of the American cities. Further than this, I worked out a plan by which, when the franchise came up, we would have some men go to Lawrence with amendments that we would be willing to accept, but which were not in the original ordinance, and have him make his fight on these. I thought we could give him a chance to make his play and then get his vote in the roundup. It was our plan to introduce an ordinance that was bad and then, under pressure, accept certain harmless amendments that were offered by men like Lawrence, who were sincere in their ideas. I also got some of the businessmen, one of our small banks, to turn their business over to him, in order they might consult with him with more influence if necessary. But even with Lawrence, it looked as though we were shy some votes if a fight were made. There was another Republican, a well-to-do merchant who lived on Commonwealth Avenue, who had been endorsed by all the reform organizations. He had risen by sheer enterprise, and now that his children were entering society, he had become ambitious for them. His name had been proposed at the country club, and some protest had gone up against his admission. I tried to arrange to overcome this. I saw the committee with whom I was intimate and gave a little dinner party to Fulton and invited the committee and their wives. Fulton was manifestly much flattered. The wives of some of our directors called upon his wife, and one of his daughters was invited to the coming out affairs of several debutantes. I never ventured to speak of the franchise question to Fulton at all, but I never lost an opportunity to discuss politics, the necessity of keeping the city Republican because of the presidential campaign of the next year, and the dangers of change and tariff to all business interests. Moreover, Fulton was a strong church worker, and the fear and suspicion that Ballantine was in some sort of alliance with the saloon keepers never left his mind. But even with Fulton, we were short. One of the councilmen was an insurance man of good standing. I wrote to our banking correspondents in New York, explaining the situation, and said that Robbins was in the council and represented one of the insurance companies. I intimated that he was in danger of injuring the company's business by his attitude on the street railway question. The banker to whom I wrote was interested in the proposed purchase of our properties, and I knew that he would go to one of the officers of the insurance company and see if some pressure could not be brought to bear on Robbins from the Home Office. In this, I was more successful than I had expected. One of the officers of the company stopped off to see with me within a few days and invited me and a couple of other directors to lunch with him and Robbins. He told Robbins that we had common friends and interests in New York, and that it would be valuable to him to be acquainted with us. What he said to Robbins I never knew, save that we never had any difficulty about his vote. In a few weeks, the ordinance was ready for introduction. It had been carefully drafted by our attorneys, who had placed a number of restrictions upon us with which we had not been in the which had not been in the old ordinance. These required us to keep the tracks which we tore up and repaired, to use girder grooved rails when ordered to do so by the council, to place vestibules on the cars and to properly heat them, to run as many cars as traffic should demand, and to make any extensions in the future which the council should require. These were all the things we would have done anyhow, but they made a good showing on paper. Moreover, so long as we controlled the council, we did not fear that these provisions would be insisted on, or on if we did not wish it. In general, the ordinance provided for a 50 years grant with a straight 5-cent fare and no transfers. We debated for a long time as to who should introduce it. We sounded Lawrence, but soon found that he was too independent. We did not want a Democrat, and it would give the ordinance a bad name at the start if it were brought in through one of the suspected Republicans. We finally decided on Fulton. He was not much of a speaker, but was honest and bore a good reputation. He finally consented to do it. Upon its introduction, Lawrence moved its reference to a special committee. Thompson ruled this out of order, and on appeal, the ordinance was referred to the regular committee on streets and railways. We then held an open meeting called by the committee for the following week for discussion, and at this meeting we expected the mayor and the opposition company to show their hand. On the day set, an immense crowd appeared of citizens, councilmen, and representatives of a competing company that had another line in the city. But by arrangement, a quorum of the committee did not appear. Another adjournment was made, but a quorum was not secured. This was kept up for a couple of weeks, and the number of persons attending constantly diminished. Finally, a meeting was held and the ordinance taken up for discussion. The Citizens Company appeared by their counsel and said they desired to offer a counter-proposition. They were prepared to accept a 25-year franchise, to take over all our plant and equipment, to pay its value as determined by arbitrators, to give 6 tickets for a quarter and universal transfers. They offered some other concessions. The committee took their proposition under advisement. I knew the company was acting in good faith and could do as they agreed. Moreover, they were backed by one of the large trust companies of the city and could not be bluffed. We called a directors' meeting to consider the situation and concluded the only safe thing to do was to get them out of the way. They had about 30 miles of road, which was a valuable property. Their stock was selling at $125 a share, and we determined to see if we could not get control. We found it was held by the president, who said he would sell out his holdings for $1 million. After some negotiations with my friends, we purchased his stock and arranged to issue stock in our company in exchange. The public did not know of the transfer, and it seemed to us we were now out of our worst difficulty. The competing company withdrew its offer, as it had not been acted on, and suggested they had found that it would not be possible for them to carry out their proposal. The stock of our company went up 10 points in the market that day, but other troubles were gathering. Thompson, the president of the council, called upon me. He said he could not keep the boys in line, that even the members of the committee were inclined to hold the ordinance up. The boys think it's up to you to do something, he said. I told them we had introduced a fair ordinance and that I thought we were doing everything we were called to do. He beat around the bush and finally said, "It ain't no use to try and play with me, Mr. Palmer. You know what I mean. The boys think there ought to be something in this for them. They say this franchise is worth $100,000 to $200,000 to you, and they think they ought to get well paid for the job." I hated this sort of thing, and I told him I could do nothing. I could not do anything for him. There was a lawyer in the city by the name of Robinson, whom we had used on several occasions in our dealings with the city. He knew all the boys and kept in touch with them. I called him in and explained the situation. I told him I did not want to have anything to do with the bloodling, but wanted to employ him as our attorney on this particular matter. I offered him a retainer of $500 and told him that he would be paid $25,000 more when the franchise was signed by the mayor or otherwise became a law. I told him what Thompson had said and advised him to see him. In a couple of weeks, the ordinance was reported back for a second hearing. It was substantially as we had drawn it. By that time, we knew we could rely on 15 votes, possibly more. Some of the amendments that we had agreed to accept were in the hands of Robbins and Fulton. One of them required us to pay into the city treasury 1% of our gross receipts after 5 years and 2% after 10 years. Robbins offered another amendment requiring us to pay a license tax of $10 a car for the use of the park fund. After some debate, these were finally accepted by the council. Finally, Lawrence rose to his feet. We were very nervous about his attitude, as we had not been able to get anything out of him. He offered amendment after amendment. They were based on the proposition of the Citizens Company. One cut the length of our franchise down to 25 years. Another compelled us to sell 6 tickets for a quarter and 8 for a quarter morning and evening when the men were going and coming from their work. Another provided for universal transfers. These were things we would not accept. Lawrence spoke simply about them. He recited condition in the other cities. He spoke of places where cheap fares prevailed, said that he had no right to bind 2 generations by our franchises, that in 20 years' time our property had become worth $15 million as measured by the stock and bonds in the market, and that the road was not worth more than 1/3 this sum according to the statement of the president of the Citizens Company. He wound up by saying that at the rate the city was growing, the property would be worth $50 million before the franchise expired. Thompson left the chair against these amendments. He flung out some reflections upon Lawrence's sincerity, said he seemed to think he was better than his party and that he was playing to the gallery. This turned out to be a bad move for Lawrence. Jumped to his feet, thoroughly aroused, he said, "Mr. President, I have been in this body less than 2 months. During this time, more things have been going on than I've ever dreamed possible. By some means or other, the committees of this council were made up of prearrangement of the street railways. Their officers and employees have been about the clerk's office for the last 2 months. There are lots of things in law that cannot be proved directly, but there is circumstantial evidence enough to show that the council has been bought. Else, how is it that a dozen men on the city council who wouldn't know a franchise from a haystack vote like wooden Indians on this subject? How does it happen that men who are earning but a few dollars a day have given up their jobs and are loafing about City Hall and saloons all the time? The whole thing is rotten," he said, and he would not vote for any franchise that seemed to have been gotten in the way. This was bad. We feared it would influence Robbins and Fulton and 1 or 2 other honest Republicans, but the amendments were lost by 2 votes. The next week, the ordinance came on for its 3rd reading. We kept constant watch of our men, and some of them were very uneasy. There had been some war agitation. Lawrence's speech was quoted. 2 men were in small retail businesses, said that the neighbors were boycotting them. Thompson said that some of the men complained that they could not stand it much longer. It was all right so far as they were concerned. But when their children came home from school and said that other children pointed their fingers at them and said their father was a bloodler, it was too much for them to stand. Robbins and Fulton said they were sick of their jobs. Their attitude was hurting them in their business. We saw it was necessary to act promptly if the ordinance was to go through. During the week, we put the pressure on Lawrence. His clients and other prominent men went to him and told him he was lining up with a bad crowd, that he was supporting the mayor, encouraging him in his demagoguery, that Ballantyne was a socialist and that Lawrence had gone back on his party and was too independent, that he ought to stand by the other members. But we were not able to budge him. When the ordinance came up, Lawrence led the fight. He said he was not in favor of doing anything that would injure or destroy property, but that the city was a partner in this enterprise. It owned the streets and should get full return for their use. Another company had offered better terms, but he was informed that they had been bought out by this company. Of course, I cannot prove it, he said, but I know, and everybody knows that this council has been bought and sold like a drove of cattle, and that they, the trustees of the people, are giving away something that does not belong to them. For myself, he had gone into politics because the city was his home, and he had felt that the evils in the city were due to ignorance. But he had learned in a few months' time that it was not ignorance so much as corruption, that it didn't make so much difference in the railways which party they used. They were nonpartisan when it came to buying votes, as he believed they had. This ordinance is an outrage, he continued. You are biding the city for 50 years. Before it expires, you will all be dead. It is well worth $10 million, and you are jamming it through with only a few weeks' consideration. Let's postpone action, lay the matter on the table, and give the public a chance to be heard. Why not submit it to the vote of the people, if this is such a good thing? During the past week, men have been to me saying that I was not a Republican, that I had been elected by the aid of that party, and now was trying to wreck it. But who is it that has questioned my republicanism? Is it the men who are back on the franchise? Men who are patriots, does not hesitate to buy this council, and even the members of this council themselves, who have been driven into the caucus? Are these the men to cry anarchy and socialism when they are undermining the government? Are they to complain because I support the mayor when they are trafficking with Democrats as well as Republicans? As for the mayor, I care not whether he is a Democrat or Republican. In this case, he is right, and I will do everything I can to defeat this wicked ordinance. The roll call was demanded as soon as he had sat down. There was intense excitement. I had gone to the council chamber, and I followed the roll call, vote by vote. When Fulton's name was reached and he voted aye, I breathed easier. Then came Robbins, the insurance man. Finally, Whitman, of whom we were not certain. They all voted aye, and with their support, we had 18 votes. The ordinance was carried. The following morning, Ballantine issued a call for a public meeting to be held in Music Hall to protest against the ordinance. He called upon the people to protest their councilmen and induced them to reconsider the vote. The week was one of uncertainty to us. There were rumors of defection. We took 5 weak-kneed councilmen out of the city to keep them free from influence. Ballantine and Lawrence were holding nightly meetings throughout the city. The Music Hall meeting was jammed. Speeches of an incendiary sort were made by Ballantine, the president of the Central Labor Union. Lawrence also spoke in a more temperate way. One speaker suggested carrying halters to the council chamber. There were charges of bribery, and the city was in ferment. The mayor's veto message came in the following night. In order that the administration might not pack the council chamber with their friends, we had ordered our employees to go to the council early and fill the galleries. The mayor's veto message was received in silence. It was then moved that the mayor's veto be not sustained. In suspense, we awaited the vote. One after another, the councilmen stood pat. Robinson had evidently done his work well, so had Buckley and McGann. They were in the council chamber in constant consultation with the members I most feared, Fulton, Robbins, and Whitman. But when they voted aye, and Thompson declared the franchise passed, my nerves relaxed, and I was more relieved that I had been in for months. During the contest, we had carried out a systematic attack on Ballantine. Terrence McGann, with his following, started out to discredit him. The council had refused to confirm his appointments. They had tried to run him out of the Jackson Club because he appointed a member of the Republicans in the fire department. We were able to influence the daily papers, who would not publish his statements and ignored everything he had done. His achievements went unheralded. We also worked up sentiment against him among the other people and said he was not enforcing the law and was levying blackmail in the saloons. In this way, we were able to split his party in two. He was left almost alone. In public functions, he was ignored, and from this time until the end of his term office of the council, overruling his wishes, refused to make appropriations and would not confirm the reforms which he had intended to inaugurate. However, he was renominated on the expiration of his term, but by this time we had organized sufficient opposition in his own party so that with a united opposition on a good man for mayor, we defeated him for re-election. I've always felt sorry for Ballantine. He was a promising young man, and had he accepted our assistance, he would have had a splendid career. But he injured his business by entering politics, as is so often the case. He had a chance for a great career, but of course, when he came to practice again, he was a marked man. What business he previously had left him, and those who had opportunities to throw his way were prejudiced against him. He struggled along for a few years under a burden. His family was socially neglected, and finally he left the city, and I have never heard what became of him. As for the franchise itself, our stock immediately went up 30 points. We increased our capital and took in the Old Citizens Company, thus increasing our lines and earnings. But the contest had been a costly one. The people had become aroused on the question as never before. It became apparent that we could not trust ourselves with open and direct primaries, as they were likely to result in the nomination of men upon whom we could not rely. We had to retain the conventional system of nomination, as well as control of the Republican Party and, if possible, both parties. Moreover, the growing hostility of the city made it apparent that we must protect ourselves in the state. It was necessary to extend our influence to the legislature, for there was constant danger that our taxes would be increased, that fares reduced, or striking legislation of some sort worked through the council that would imperil our interests. All right, we're going to stop off here at chapter 6. We have a super sticker from Hello for 99 cents. Thank you. We have in the chat, Ironic Coolness, the Irreverent GF. Yeah, it's been crooked for a long time, and that's, of course, why this book needs to be read. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter which party, because a lot of these moneyed interests will support either one. Okay, tune in next week. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.